So welcome to the last invited talk panel of the conference. We have two awesome speakers speaking about relatively distant topics. Fantastic speakers in this last session. So as usual, we're not going to do big introductions like we do at Code. So first up is Claudia.
Hey. So the title is on hardships of creative design. I was tempted to call it the hardships of creating creative creatives, but I thought it was a little bit too cute. It's not just a story about hardships of creative design. It's also a story of a deep frustration on a personal level. And as usually with frustrations, they all start because of great expectations. So some of you may have heard some of my talks over the last years here at Code. I had the great pleasure of being here. And so I reported some of the work that our company had done. So I work for an ad tech company where we basically have full control over showing ads in the programmatic environment, meaning bidding on the opportunities, selecting who we show ads to. And one of the uses of that environment, besides targeting and kind of the business side, was to do some experimentation and to measure causal impact. And so the study that I talked about before was by Giovanni, and it was a lot of fun. We had this very interesting experiment where we had all of these different creatives and then did a nice A/B test, kind of randomly showing them against some kind of public service announcement. And more so than wanting to know whether they actually really change behavior by measuring whether people, after seeing the ad, buy more yogurt in stores than the people who saw PSAs. What we were really after are these interesting interaction effects, kind of heterogeneous behavior, that it's not just like the one right creative, it's about we're all different and we all respond to messages differently. You want to sell me something, just make sure there's a horse in the picture somewhere. So we were interested in seeing kind of the heterogeneity, and we had these cool results. These are the kind of lifts that you saw. This is for a population kind of segregated based on the type of fast food they are interested in. And somewhat consistently, you see that the image had to show the product. That worked the best. Very different, for instance, people who actually bother to cook. They don't care to see the product, meaning a yogurt, but they have more of this understanding of lifestyle and what they do with their lives. So this is about cooking, clearly. So that study, which we did about 2 or 3 years ago, really where my expectations had come from. And I was super psyched when Sinan asked me to come in here and talk again and give a keynote, because we had started up a couple of new projects where we wanted to really play with the statistical power to kind of push this further and then also target people selectively and see whether overall the campaign impact could be greater. And then the reality hit. And the reality is this. So next study, forget heterogeneous impact. I mean, there's just no impact to start with, let alone heterogeneous. And since there shouldn't be a negative one, I can't even hope for it to balance out somehow with the negative and the positive numbers. So then you look at the creatives, and these were the creatives. I mean, you really have to squint hard and pay a lot of attention to even figure out what the differences are, right? So one thing I've learned in this process, that as we have tried to make this a product and go out to brands and convince them to run these analyses to understand how their consumer interact with messages, it seems to be really difficult to get them to come up with good creatives. Now, this is not always the case. Let's talk about the potato. Anybody knows this particular potato? So this is a 30-second video ad that was shown during the Super Bowl. And I mean, the potato wasn't moving or anything. It was just sitting there for 30 seconds. There were certain reactions. I'm not sure what you were looking for, but it was certainly noticed by some population. And so meet the culprit, true to form, Cards Against Humanity. What made the story more fun is they wrote up a very brilliant blog about the fact that they're now out of business because the ROI of this effort was exactly 0. They had to pay about $500,000 on this. And then they stepped back and talked a little bit about everything that went wrong. And so here are the lessons. Particularly, how did they get there? Because they did this market study, and apparently potatoes are quite favored by the US population. And then the fact that they didn't ponder enough whether this had anything to do with their brand. And finally, the notion that their sample size may have been too small in the process. Now, of course, all of this is fake news. I mean, this all is a big hoax, and they're not out of business, so you can continue to buy their cards. But it's an interesting way to think about, well, how are creatives created these days? I mean, what is the state of the art when it comes to designing creatives? And some of them are really great, but what's kind of the standard fare? So I went to investigate, and apparently the one starting point is the creative brief. Has this kind of format. That's what the creative agency gets to figure out what to do. And I would like to point you to section 0.3, which indeed asks, who is the audience? Now, mind you, heterogeneity, let's not get carried away. A usual customer will do. So, for instance, a 30-something male, give or take, ballpark, right? Now, if this is what you start when you think about how to design a good message, I'm not super surprised if what you end up with is somewhat limited. Now, I'm not officially allowed to say who the client is, so please bear with me. I mean, I can't fully hide it either, but okay, let's talk about the client. Preparing this talk, obviously I didn't see the creative brief that we got, but I did find a creative brief from that very client that I was running a test for, and I would like you to meet Lauren. She lives in Ohio, apparently, and likes yoga. Enough said. At the end of all this, this is where we got to. This is the result of that process. And look, there's only that much experimentation you can do when your A and your B is basically both a 0. Which is interesting. In advertising, I mean, my day job is doing all that machine learning for targeting. But the reality is, if you have a 0 impact creative, you don't need to bother targeting. Whereas if you have any better than 0 impact creative, you can actually do better without targeting. So it seems to be a complete kind of waste of effort if you think about where all the work and the machine learning and the data is going. So this was the result. We did look a little bit underneath, and there wasn't terrible much variation between those 3 options of sugar, oranges, and no GMO. And kind of the personalities that we could identify. And so I've come out of that year of attempting to do some really, really cool causal inference and so on, saying, well, we really have to rethink as an industry how the creatives are created. Can't we bring some of these cool data insights that we get because we are in such a data-rich environment back to the client and help them come up with more? So it all starts really with lots of data. And this is kind of the reality of the data that we as an advertising tech company have. We have the order of 150 billion events every day that get kind of attached to devices. You have these very elaborate behavioral histories. You can connect them, devices to each other. You can bring in purchase behavior. And so while you may, in fact, not be able to ask cookies questions, the good news is that they don't hide much, and they typically don't lie either. So what can we do with this data going into? And so here is kind of some work that has absolutely nothing to do with causality or experimentation, but it is about bringing some of the machine learning into the creative design by understanding audiences better before you even kind of go off with this creative brief idea. What can we do? And here we worked, by the way, the way we got to this gig is the guy who did the Giovanni study. He changed jobs, and he got hired by a European oat milk company. And kind of he wanted to go back, and we are not at the point where we can run creative testing because they aren't yet in the US, so we don't have purchase. But we started at just looking at the traffic that goes to that company's homepage and reads about the product. So this is really a going-to-market problem. And we try to scale what's known as segmentation. That's not a new idea in marketing either, but how do you do clustering when you have tens of millions of dimensions in this very data-rich environment? So just from a machine learning perspective, doing something unsupervised in millions of dimensions gets really tricky. So that took some work here. And what it found is, in this case, kind of 7 different subgroups. And the first one, that is actually has a big X over it, there's a very good proportion of people who actually are working for advertising and just showing interest in the product. So there's this kind of set of websites that characterizes this one subpopulation, and many of them are in some way related to advertising. So I have to assume that they're advertising professionals just being interested in this brand. What about the 4 other ones that are actually have a green? So they're really kind of 4 populations that we found in here. And there was some work around kind of labeling them manually, but it's interesting to understand the nuances beyond kind of the Lauren living in Ohio. So we have to give it some name. You can't just tell the client it's subpopulation 1, so we called it something, so it's the health nut. But what you can see here if you look underneath is really kind of a lot of reading around recipes, so cooking themselves with clearly kind of vegan focus. So this is one very specific population that is interested in the product. Somewhat different, like the trendsetters, we have a lot more fashion going on. And there may be some overlaps between these 2 groups, but the focal point of what they are interested in is clearly different here. And then finally, we call them the do-it-yourself, although I don't think it's do-it-yourself. It's more kind of a quirky set of interest along a number of different, from design to a lot of like museum, artsy. So it's yet a different type of personality that is hiding under this umbrella of people who are interested in oat milk, of all things. So I have great expectations for this test. Hopefully by next year we actually have some results if indeed we were to use these kind of insights to create creatives and see whether indeed it can affect people in an A/B test thereafter. So thank you very much.
Anyone question while we're getting the next speaker? All right, next up is Tavneet.
Thanks, everyone. I'm gonna actually stand over here because there's a bright light there. Okay, great. So I'm gonna kind of violate 2 big rules that seem to be in this conference, maybe not rules, social norms. One is I'm gonna talk about work that has no results yet at all. So it's stuff that's in the field, and the idea is just to spark some ideas around what we're doing, to talk about what we're doing. And I'm gonna talk about a completely different part of the world. So I'm gonna start off by doing a bit of background. A lot of the work I've seen has been on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. The beauty of those is you don't have to start by saying, so we do an experiment with Twitter. Twitter is a social network that people use. Don't need to do that. I'm gonna have to do that because I'm working in a part of the world that probably, at least everybody should have heard of, but probably don't know the context and the background for. So over the last year, and hopefully for the next decade, maybe 2, we're going to be doing a bunch of digital experimentation in East Africa around a whole bunch of digital products. These are not going to be online digital, so it's going to be a very different sense of digital. They're going to be mobile phone based in general, and often not even smartphone based, think dumb phone. Okay, so that's kind of the context. And we're trying to kind of build an understanding of what sorts of products people want, need, improve their lives in these sorts of contexts, and how can we build them in the most effective ways. Okay, so I'm going to start off setting up some background. Has anybody heard of mobile money? A few. Okay, so let me give you a quick background on what this is and what digital stuff is. So Nowadays, in most of sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world, you can use your phone sort of like a bank account. So think of a Apple Pay on your phone, but without a credit card on the back end. It's just using your phone as the identification and using a kind of SMS system to do transfers across people. Okay, so and it works all on a dumb phone. So that's mobile money. And since mobile money has arrived, basically every household in Kenya now has a mobile money account, which is pretty impressive. Over the last decade, this is what's transformed kind of how people think of their phone and what their phone can do. Okay? And on top of it has been layered a whole bunch now of product services, a huge amount of data, all sorts of other stuff that comes with it. So let me start off by sort of describing one study where we do have results, which is not an experiment, and then I'll talk about 2 experiments that are in the field. So on top of mobile money has come this ability to offer people credit on their phones without them having to go to a bank. So this was started by a bank in Kenya that has no branches except one headquarters office. Okay, and so they had no kind of usual customers. They were kind of a lender to other banks, so kind of playing in the interbank market. They decided they wanted consumers, but how do I get consumers if I have no branches? So they built a digital product that works on mobile money. So how does this work? I open up an account on my phone. I don't have to ever go into a bank at all. I can request a loan on my phone. They use data on my mobile money expenditures, my mobile money transactions to credit score me. If I pass a credit score, the money gets dispersed into my account. If I want to withdraw it in cash, I shift it into my mobile money account and withdraw it from my mobile money account like I would usually. I never need to see a loan officer. I never need to talk to anybody. I never need to go to a branch. I don't actually have to do anything except have a phone and kind of run through the phone. Okay? If I want to put money in my account, I dump it into my mobile money account and sort of pass it through into this bank account. So we've done a bunch of work around mobile money, finding it's actually reduced poverty rates in Kenya. And then we did this study on M-Shwari, which is one of the biggest digital credit products. If you've heard of Tala or Branch or any of these are other digital lenders in the same space who are doing the same thing. Some of them on smartphones. This is not on a smartphone. This is on a dumb phone. So it has sort of 70% penetration in the country now. And we found that what digital credit did or is doing in Kenya is it's improved people's ability to deal with bad events. When something bad happens, I can quickly take out a loan, right? I don't need to go to a branch. They don't have to come check me out, visit my house, do all these things. I just get approved and I get a loan immediately. Okay, so it's kind of really super quick. So it improves their ability to deal with bad events because they're pulling out loans and then they can pay them back later. And it increases their propensity to spend on education. Some of them are borrowing to spend on education. So that's kind of the context. This is pretty low-income people. Half the country lives on under $1 a day. Yet they have a mobile phone, which is turning out to be one of the most powerful things they own, right? And most of these are dumb phones again. So think, the old Nokia brick. Half of you are too young to know what an old, it's like, it used to look like a brick. It's an old Nokia brick. Everything works on SMS. It's not a smartphone. And that's kind of the main tool used by most people, yet it allows you to do this. Okay, so let me tell you about the 2 experiments that are in the field now on mobile phone stuff. The first one is a digital bond. So the government of Kenya launched or allowed people to buy very small units of a bond, of a government bond. Okay, so think of 5-year government bond. You can buy $30 worth of a government bond, which is a tiny sum of money relative to most bond purchases. You can't buy $30 of a bond here, for example. And you do it entirely on your mobile phone. Okay, so not a smartphone, a dumb phone. I can load up a USSD code and basically say, I want to buy a bond. It'll allow me to open a trading account, an actual proper trading account on my mobile phone. I buy the bond, and I can trade the bond in the bond market live when I want to get rid of it, all off of this one USSD app. Okay? So this was launched in Kenya about 6 months ago, and working together with kind of administrative data and survey data, we're trying to understand what impact this has on people's lives. So the big plus side of the bond is it's paying a pretty reasonable rate of return. It's kind of 10% a year, which is a pretty decent rate of return. I just saw questions. Yeah, interest rates are slightly higher in the developing world, but it's a pretty decent rate of return for poor people. Most poor people, when they save in banks, don't make anything, and they have withdrawal fees in banks, so they're actually losing money when they put money in banks. So we basically did an experiment. There's a pretty large experiment ongoing in Kenya now where we've given a whole bunch of people access to this and kind of shown them how to use it and reminded them to take it up. So kind of an encouragement style design of a field experiment. And then we're kind of watching them buy, trade, et cetera. And something we're trying to understand is not just impact on people's lives, but one thing that we failed to really understand in development is how to really get people to be more financially literate. Okay, we can't seem to do that in a very effective way. Whatever financial literacy training happens around the place has zero impact. So one of the hypotheses I had is, well, maybe you learn by doing. If we can get you to buy and trade, maybe you'll start to understand interest rates and kind of bits of financial transactions better. So we're measuring a whole bunch of financial literacy. So I want to take a quick detour there for a second, which is just to talk about what the bit that's sort of turning out most valuable in these environments is, much as we have a lot of data, and there's a lot of data on transactions, it's not the data-rich environment that you have here. Okay, it's nothing compared to that environment, which means that we usually need to sort of add two bits of things together. One is administrative data plus survey data. Okay, in every experiment we're doing, we're complementing most of our analysis with survey data. Because much as the data is rich, it's not going to give us enough. It's not going to tell us enough of the story. It's not going to be able to tell us mechanisms of why things happened. And so whichever experiment I'm starting, I'm realizing that it's really hard not to combine with survey data. It's almost impossible not to. Okay, this means that your costs of experimentation kind of go up exponentially. We'll have an end line on this in the field in about 6 months. Kenyan politics. Conditional on Kenyan politics. So that's kind of the first experiment I wanted to talk about. It's a really, really creative idea from the government to try and include a whole bunch of people into kind of a very traditional government fundraising campaign, in quotes, but allowing people a return and trying to go down the poverty spectrum of who can do this. Okay? All right, I'll talk about one more. How am I doing on time? Left? Okay, good. So I want to talk about the second experiment. So I should say these are very different stages. This experiment launched about 3 weeks ago. So this shows you kind of the amount of data being used per month per person across Africa. Okay, so these might look like small numbers. They're not. They actually surprised me when I saw them last week. And these are mostly on your phone. Okay. I want to do one caveat again. These are not necessarily all smartphones. There are a bunch of kind of Nokia-ish looking phones that are data enabled that are not smartphones. I did not know this existed, but this exists. And basically they come preloaded with a browser and a couple of apps. You can't download apps, you can't do anything, but there's these data enabled non-smartphones around. So it could be those two. Okay, so one of the things I've been interested in over the last, or gotten interested over the last few months is trying to understand what true benefits the internet provides people and what it actually does to people's lives. Does it change our attitudes? Does it change our skill set? We go on YouTube and watch something about how to be, I don't know, a mechanic or whatever. Is it providing employment opportunities? Is it just a social networking tool because most people in Africa are using WhatsApp and not really the internet, and so I get access to social networks much more cheaply over WhatsApp? So we're running an experiment now where we're trying to take a population of people who have not used data before. They have a data-enabled phone. This is not a smartphone. Most of them have these, again, Nokia. It has a browser called Opera Mini, which I had never heard of, but in Africa, this is the most popular browser around. And these are all data-enabled phones, yet these people have never used data in their lives. Okay? So we basically pulled a sample of clients who basically have no data use at all, and said, what if we gave them free data? So we have now set up this experiment a few weeks ago where a couple of thousand people got 15 gigs of free data. So if monthly data is about 120 megs a person, this is quite a lot of data. Okay, they can probably watch a Man United, Man City soccer game once a week for 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, something like that sounds about right. And then we gave 2,000 people 5 gigs, and we're kind of tracking how this affects them both. And again, we're going to complement survey data with admin data. So the beauty of this is that you can track all of kind of what they do on their phones, right? I can see whether their social networks go. We'll see the mobile money transactions and stuff. But we're also going to try and understand through surveys, how does this affect their attitudes? How does it affect kind of social attitudes, not just political attitudes? Is it affecting their job search and employment? Is it affecting kind of, you know, the information they have? So we're going to try and sort of also pick up, like, you know, how informed are they about the world in general? And so a lot of that will come off the survey data, because it turns out you can't do that in admin data, right? I can't do attitudes in admin data. So we'll follow them up in about 6 months and do a whole bunch of surveys around trying to understand how kind of their lives have changed as a result of having data. And the other thing we're layering on top is kind of trying to tell them how to use data, because it turns out they might not know what Google is, and they might not know what Opera Mini is. And so we've been doing a bunch of messaging around sort of getting them on the web, getting them to use this, getting them to use Google and other links. So hopefully the next time code comes around, I might have some results for you. OK, so let me wrap up, since I think I'm probably close to out of time. You know, it's been really fun trying to do digital experiments in this part of the world. It is a completely different context, a completely different environment. You know, we get excited by, you know, when we did our digital credit study, we kind of had a sample of about 600,000 borrowers, and we got really excited by 600,000. I know that sounds really small in this room, but for us, I was like, oh my God, that's huge. It's awesome. Most of our experiments run in the 1,000 range. And so it is opening up a data vault for development economists as well to do experiments. But we're also realizing how much we miss with just admin data or A/B testing strategies, because it's just not rich enough for us to learn as much as we'd like to learn. And so I think I'm realizing, much as there's a lot to do, we also kind of have to complement it with collecting survey data and sort of trying to piece those together to learn more. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Question for Tavneet as I get the panelists up on the panel. So I had a question, actually, Tavneet, for you. So yeah, let's just use. Why don't we use these two, and I'll use this one. I think they actually want us in the light,
so really?
that they can record it. So
I knew I would foul up something.
As you know, I also do field experiments in Africa, and I was thinking about your question about surveys, and I completely agree with you there, as well as admin data. But surveys, and you mentioned that the cost goes up exponentially with surveys. But why not do the surveys on the phone?
So we do a lot of phone call surveys.
Well, why not use the USSD line?
Yeah, so the USSD in Kenya is actually pretty expensive.
Okay.
And the response rate is worse.
Okay.
And so you may as well call them. That's kind of the trade-off that we have. The one we're experimenting with now is IVR. We're doing a bunch of stuff where we can do 15 questions on IVR without much drop-off and with pretty decent take-up, hopefully. And so IVR will be way cheaper. And you know, I get my data in a day, not 6 weeks. So that will really help if we can get IVR to work.
Do any of these have incentives to, for instance, so what we do is part of our experiment, just to give everybody a very brief summary, is we're doing referral strategies, so peer-to-peer referrals to encourage your friends to take an HIV test, where the incentive is you get free mobile minutes on your cell phone. And the way we get them to complete the survey is I refer you, and you put in your code to get your free minutes, but you can't get it until you finish my survey.
Yeah.
So the response rates are likely to be much higher in that case.
Yeah, I think for us, so 2 things. We're a lot less educated than your population in all likelihood.
What do you mean?
You're in South Africa, right?
Yes. Oh, you mean Kenya versus South Africa?
Kenya is going to be much less educated. So I think that's going to be one of the issues, is the quality of the responses that come back is going to be an issue.
How many languages?
So in Kenya, just, well, one, but you might need 7.
Okay.
Depending on how poor you get. The poorer you get, the more likely you are to need a non-national language.
Yeah.
Uganda, like, way too many. But with IVR, we can do languages.
Yes.
Because we record the survey in languages, and they pick a language, like 1, 2, or 3.
Exactly.
And
that's what we do.
so, so IVR, I think, is going to work out better for us in the short run.
Cool. Awesome.
But
sounds great.
Yeah. Happy to talk about survey strategies with anybody.
So we have questions from the audience. Yes.
Hi. So this question is for Tavneet, but I guess is related to what you were talking about, Claudia. I guess, how are you thinking about messaging in your experiments? Like, how much of the experimental design is figuring out how to recruit participants and like how to get this adoption of even entering into this investment program?
Yeah, so it depends on the experiment. So, in both of these, we haven't varied the message experimentally, partly because we think take-up might be low, and so at that point, the general wisdom is throw everything you have at it and don't vary it. I think if we get decent take-up, then we'll probably do a follow-up changing messaging in some way. I think on the internet one, I think we have already a 10% take-up, which is actually pretty striking to me, given we only implemented a couple weeks ago. But the bond one, the take-up is much lower. So we didn't vary messaging because we just wanted every sort of message to go out to try and get as much take-up as possible. We have done experiments. So we did an experiment in the last Kenyan election, which it's a bit depressing to talk about Kenyan elections right now. But we varied the messaging. But we had something like 6 million people in the experiment, at which point I can vary messaging and have effects. So you kind of have to trade off power, sample size, and take-up issues. And so sometimes we'll vary it, and sometimes we just want to get take-up, understand what's going on, and then try and design after that.
Yeah, I mean, just a follow-up question on that for both of you, which is, one of the common points of these two talks is sort of like a lot of us here, we think about experimental design and statistical interference and all of these nuanced things, but one of the probably the most important thing you have to think about first is what is the intervention, right? And so you are looking at a map of data use and you're thinking about, what is just to ask the question, what does the internet give people and what does it do for people? Then you have to say
in Africa.
In Africa.
Yeah,
in
I can't
Africa,
do it here. Yeah, let me caveat a little.
And then the question is, well, how do I test that? Like, what do I do? What is the intervention that's creative enough that will generate some activity that can be measured and so on? So I'll just ask you both to comment about sort of how do you go? Do you have some process by which you think about the interplay between the research question and the precise definition of the intervention that you finally land on?
So, my observation is that I'm absolutely convinced that you need smart, innovative, creative people to come up with good messaging. I don't think machines should be doing creative design. Forget Africa, just talking about advertising. Whenever machines do creative design, I often then see that what we're optimizing for is not really what we're interested in. It's like the classical, you're looking under the street light because that's where the light is. So you see a lot of creative optimization in click optimization simply because the conversion rate is high enough that you can try a whole bunch of things. And the only thing that the machine eventually figures out is that the no thank you button should have the exact same color as the background to make sure it's as invisible as possible, right? It works. Creative optimization surely does, but often only to the wrong outcome. And so when you're talking about things where your conversion rate or your reaction is really subtle, like you're looking for a subtle impact or it's rare or those things, it's almost the bias variance in machine learning. You need kind of the human bias to think about to narrow down the choices. And I think the message I wanted to provide, the real question to me is, how can we use data to make people creative? Right? I mean, I think people are innovative by themselves, but either it's an incentive problems. It's like nobody ever got fired when they hired IBM. It's like, if you just come up with a blah, run-of-the-mill creative, you can't be fired for having done the wrong thing, because the same brand, orange juice brand, went through a complete dud when they tried to do package redesign, and they had to pull it from the market because it did a lot more harm. So I think I'm really interested by now in the interplay of how can you get the right type of data in the right way in front of people to make them creative and think well about message design and intervention. So that interplay, I think, for me, has become much more relevant at this point than statistical inference almost.
Yes, Nat, I don't know that I have a great answer to your question. I think, so I spend a reasonable amount of time in the field, and I think it's just about finding a question that, like, you know, the internet one is an interesting one because if you look at any smartphone projection for Africa, it's going to go up really fast. And so asking it early is almost essential. Like even all the work I did on mobile money, we started working on it the year it got launched. Before it was like everywhere. And so I think that's one key, is trying to sort of pick up on things before they become completely popular, because then the questions are completely different. And then it's really about kind of how do you pick up the effects of what you want to see in a field experiment where you're not going to have 1 million people and you're not going to be able to pick up small effects, et cetera. So that's where even it's related to the earlier question that you're going to give up on trying to change messaging to get take up. You're going to you're going to throw everything at it to try and get take up. And sometimes you luck out. I think Emma Kiba, honestly, I think will fail. I don't think we'll get enough take up from what the numbers look like at the moment. So I think that will fail. And you will have failures. And with M-Pesa, it took off like crazy and we succeeded. So you kind of have a few of these and some of them fail and some of them don't. And hopefully it works out okay in the end.
I had a question to Tavneet.
Sure.
I was just generally wondering whether you could use the entire infrastructure that you have set up there to incentivize people to take MOOCs and then directly study the effectiveness of MOOCs. And essentially, I was even thinking, if you go wild, then you can basically substitute away from high school and just provide basic MOOCs to get
The government won't like that because they just made secondary education free.
Right.
They're spending money for nothing, but it is nothing anyways. I'm kidding. You could absolutely do that. The only problem is smartphones are still not quite there. So there's actually an MBA student of ours who's working on compression techniques so that you could do a MOOC on a dumb phone. And so if you can do a MOOC on a dumb phone, then life starts to change quite dramatically. Otherwise, it's probably another 5 years before you get there. There's a couple people trying to do text-based learning, like you send a message to someone for the answer on your homework kind of stuff. But
Actually, like in the old days, there were these training centers where they had a PC, and you just tell them, go there, take the MOOC.
I would need a training center with a PC. I don't have a training center with a PC.
Mobile phones.
Remember, these are all
Yeah.
mobile phone experiments. There's nothing, there's very little internet penetration that's not mobile phone. There is some internet cafes, but this is all mobile phones. And internet cafes are going to die, right? Everything is going to be on the mobile phone. And the beauty is, because of mobile money, these people are very used to using their mobile phones for everything, right? Apple Pay took so long here. People are happy to use their mobile phones for everything, right? So it has to be on the mobile phone, but absolutely, you could easily do that at some point. Yeah.
Let's go to Dan, then Ben.
Yeah, I was just wondering, are you going to be measuring outcomes in the bond market to see if it gets more liquid, deeper, if people prefer to invest in bonds over stocks?
Absolutely. So one of my hypothesis, maybe not completely uninformed hypothesis, but maybe a little uninformed, was that the reason they did this was the bond market wasn't liquid enough, and there wasn't basically a market. It was sort of a few people, and when there's only a few people in a market, you know what happens to outcomes. So I think the reason they were doing this is to try and make these markets more competitive, basically. And so absolutely, we'll definitely be looking at that too. Yeah.
I guess I have a question for each. So Claudia, do you see any role for the algorithm or machine to help with creativity?
I mean, to me, my creativity seems to be very much working with machines. I mean, I get ideas when I look at quirky things in data, and that's kind of what I almost need constraints. I mean, the worst thing is to tell me, okay, go come up with a cool picture for a campaign. I have no idea. So I feel like the more constraints my brain gets, the more interesting the problem and the more I can do with it. So in that sense, kind of more data can act that way. And I feel we haven't made as much progress. I think there's a lot of visualization out there that I would consider data porn, or sorry, a way of communicating foregone conclusions. I think we're really good at telling you what the data has to tell. I'm not sure how to get to this more explorative environment where you kind of, walking through data, get ideas, and it's not just, here's what I want you to understand. So we're exploring with some of those things, but I haven't seen anything like perfect for that one. But I think it's one of the most, as you think about augmented realities, I mean, this is where the world's going to have these environments that share additional information with you. And the question really becomes, will it stymie our innovation and creativity, or will it be able to motivate us to do great things? I think the word's out there. Well, we have to figure it out.
Thank you. So for Tavneet, like, did you do a pilot study? It seems like you're very unpredictable situation. Like, do you have a stopping rule?
Do I have a stopping rule? I think my stopping rule yesterday was different than today. So sometimes we do pilots. In both of these, we did not. Because, so for the bond study, we kept wanting to do a pilot, and then politics kind of takes over on these things, and the bond got launched, and we had 2 days notice it was getting launched, rather than 6 weeks notice for us to pilot, et cetera, et cetera. Other field experiments we've done, we'll set up a pilot and let it run. I think the thing is, most of our outcomes are not that short term, right? I don't care about revenue on data. That's not my interest. If there's more revenue on data or less, I couldn't care less for the company, right? I'm interested in how does it affect people's lives, which means I can't measure that in a day or 2 days. We have to wait 6 months. So if we're piloting as well, it'll add that. The data one, we did not pilot either. But, at some point we do, so with things that are costlier, the data one was pretty easy, right? I just kind of give people some data. If it's not taken up, we don't do the survey. It's really that simple. So for that, there's a very easy stopping rule. I've done a bunch of field experiments in agriculture, which take you a year to pilot because you need to wait for the rains. And there we have very concrete stopping rules, like, logistical stopping rules on the interventions as well, because some of these interventions, like Sinan's, revolve around people and people's behavior. And so even the Amakiba one, if we don't get enough take up and we have we've got power calculations, then you don't do the inline survey and you give the money back to the donor and say it didn't work. So we have stopping rules like that, where basically you say, did I get enough take up? Do I have enough power to measure something? Or were the logistics of the intervention so bad that the intervention became something else that will then stop? Did that answer?
Yeah. So Claudia, you mentioned the downside of a totally machine-based creative design, but have you or other people thought of like a hybrid approach, like a human-in-the-loop creative design? So what I mean by that is, like, use a deep learning algorithm to sift through lots of previous ads to generate a set of, say, 50, 60 profiles for humans to look at, and then humans could see or decide, like, maybe some combination of those profiles to use in the ads?
So Again, this is kind of a hobby of mine on the side. We are not a creative agency. I know that people are playing around with using interesting technologies to combine different snippets of videos that are broadly kind of tailored to a product but have different facets to them depending on who they think they want to reach. But I think all of that still comes to the question, do we know what we're optimizing for? Or do you have a vaguer sense, okay, I know that this particular group of my possible consumers is anxiety driven, right? I mean, if you peg it on something, but there's still this hypothesis out there. I mean, you have to start somewhere. And just looking at historical ads, if you don't have good measurements how successful they were, and for the most part, I think that has been kind of the conversation in the ad breakout session, we don't have yet good historical data on what actually worked, other than the more proliferated metrics like people clicked a lot on it or shared it a lot or these things, where it's not really clear that it correlates enough with what you really care about to make for a good proxy. So I do feel very strongly you need kind of the collaboration, but I agree, I think technology has a huge opportunity to become a tool to get out of some of the tediousness. I'm not enough in the industry involved on the creative side to see what is the kind of really greatest, other than some broad kind of Twitter analysis. I haven't seen yet something that I feel serves that purpose.
Hi, I have a question for Tavneet. With digital access to the poor parts of Kenya, has there been a big concern about misuse? Because when you're that poor, you obviously don't have digital literacy. So, for example, there are some very poor areas in India that I've been to, and they have whatever little money they earn, they'll buy a phone with it, or they'll buy a TV with it, and they won't have money to eat food. So because there's no literacy, there has been a big misuse. So has no digital literacy been a concern?
It's a great question. So I don't think of it in the phone purchase problem. So most of the phones that first came in are actually, so all the my age, Sinan age people in the room, our old Nokias got refurbished and sent back to Africa. Mm-hmm. So these are very, very cheap phones. They're not buying $50 phones, right? I mean, they're buying this refurbished old Nokia that was my old phone or Sinan's old phone. So I don't think that's where it is. The bit that I've started doing some work around and really thinking about is the digital credit space. Because now credit is so much easier to get. Before I would have to go to a bank. The bank was 10 kilometers away. That's already a big cost for me. But now I can just do it on my phone in 5 seconds and get a loan in 10 minutes. And so you start to wonder whether people really understand interest rates and costs and things like that enough to really know that they're doing something that's good for them. So that's one, there's a great field experiment done by one of my collaborators in Turkey where they gave a discount on an overdraft interest rate. And they sort of sent a bunch of people messages saying, we're going to discount your interest rate on the overdraft by quite a bit. And take-up went down. And it's because people realized that they were paying a lot. Mm-hmm. And they went, uh-oh, I was paying so much, I don't want this, right? Mm-hmm. So we started to think of those sorts of consumer protection issues. And then a lot of the digital credit lenders, when you default, report you to the credit reporting agency, right? So I take a $3 loan or a $5 loan, and I default on $5, and I get into a bad report with the consumer reporting agency, which means I can never get a loan ever again, right? And so people don't quite understand that either. What's reporting to the bureau? They're like, I don't even know what the bureau is. Who cares? Report me to someone. I don't know that someone. It doesn't matter, right? So thinking of the consumer protection side is something we're doing now. So we're trying to design a couple of experiments around how do you give people an understanding of the consumer protection side? How do you get them to understand interest rates and what interest rates actually mean? Because some of these short-term loans, will say, oh, it's a 10% fee a month. And people think, oh, that's small. Because in their head, they're not compounding that 10% a month is like 150% APR, right? So I think those are the bits that I worry about more than the phone itself, is kind of these other products that are coming on that people might not understand. That's why our bond study was really thinking about, can we get people to be more literate financially and understand returns and when they should sell and when they should buy.
Yeah. Question here, and then there's a question up here that needs a mic. Oh, you have
Yes,
one. Okay, go ahead, and then over here. Yeah.
I guess my question is about creativity. So when you have an intervention and let's say you have an inconclusive result like we've seen, I guess you can possibly draw to a conclusion. One is it was not creative enough, or maybe there is nothing to explore there. And if you're in a company setting like we are, then you can be, okay, should we keep exploring with a different and more creative thing? Or should we just pull the plug on this thing and like move on to something else? And I understand it's like a very domain specific and a kind of a subjective question, but what do you guys think about, I guess, how to go about that?
I mean, my sense is there's usually not a, I mean, it's so context dependent in my opinion. If I had never seen the Chobani results, I wouldn't have had any expectations going in there for the next iteration. So in some sense, I mean, I was highly doubtful that you can pick up. I mean, there's been interesting work arguing that you can't correctly measure internet, like advertising display effectiveness anyway. And so I guess only by having convinced myself in the past was I reasonably sure that it wasn't a matter of the mechanism the experiment was run, because the first forerunner is, well, look, we're measuring whether somebody buys something in a store. That gets somehow attached to a household. That gets somehow attached to a cookie that then I have to target, right? I mean, you have an idea how much can break in that thing. So hadn't I seen the results on Giovanni, I may not have ever looked at the creative and said, well, it's probably somewhere in there that we have a kind of a weakening of the signal based on things. I think so it's really coming, like thinking about what is the weakest link in the line to feel what can be done. So I have absolutely no silver bullet to give other than kind of your common sense and experience as to what the usual culprits are. Usually I think the intervention is hopefully okay. I mean, the business judgment rule, these brands have been in the business for 100 years. They should be knowing what they're doing. So that was kind of the last place to look when I finally got there. But I think it's really super context dependent where you feel, is it worth digging a little deeper or do you just throw the towel?
I have no idea. I'm not a product builder, so not kind of my expertise.
Well, I mean, to me, it's very similar to this question. A null result may not be that informative, right? It could be that that the actual thing you're trying to test is real, but the test that you designed for it is not very good. And that was my essential question, is like, how do you know whether your intervention is good enough to test the sort of theoretical thing underneath it that you're actually trying to get at? That the intervention is some proxy for the actual theoretical thing that you're interested in. The intervention as proxy could be bad. The study could be underpowered. There could be a number of things, and the null result, you might take away from that, there's no effect, and the theory that I'm testing has been rejected. Or, maybe I didn't test it well enough. And yeah, I think that's a really important question. I mean, I think, we overlook the importance of formulating a rigorous research question where every word in the question has been vetted for, is it tractable? Is it important? Is it reasonable? Is it testable? Does the design test exactly this question? Is the intervention sufficient to test the underlying theory? Is the experiment sufficiently powered to, given the expectation of some treatment response, to detect that response, and so on and so forth? I think that all comes back to the question. And I think that we spend too little time thinking about the question.
Can I add two things?
Yeah, sure.
One is we usually, especially with people who are implementing for us, if we're working with a partner who's implementing the intervention and we're not implementing, we do something called the theory of change, where we sit down with the partner and work through kind of from the intervention to the outcome we're measuring, how do we get there? What's kind of the mechanism through which this would affect that? partly because I want them to be on the same page as me about the theory of change. If they think there's a different theory of change, then we got to go back to the drawing board. So I think that's one, is really articulating what we call a theory of change.
Because in the field, even though you spend a lot of time in the field, in the implementation, they're sort of representing you.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And so we do this exercise with every implementer, which is what's the theory of change, whiteboard it up. Make sure that we're on the same page about the theory of change. Because also our outcome measurement will depend on that theory of change. I want to show that it was because of this, right? So our survey instrument will have all those bits and pieces in it. So that's one. The other one we actually do a lot of, when I say I'm in the field a lot, is we do a lot of focus groups. So we'll go run focus groups in communities we're working in before we're doing an intervention, before we even pilot. And I think that all gets skipped. We never talk about that stuff.
Yep.
Where we'll be thinking about a new technology and we'll go spend time in the field and say, is this going to work? Is it not going to work? What are people missing? Will this fit kind of what they're missing in that sense? And so I think we never really talk about focus groups enough, even though they really matter for us ending up at an implementer, a design, and a survey instrument ultimately.
Yeah.
Sorry, can I just plus one that comment? I just want to plus one that.
Oh, okay, great.
Plus one
yeah.
that. Oh, thank you.
Thumbs up.
I like the like button.
This ends up,
Yeah.
I think, sort of related to where you were heading there. It's with the theory of change, I guess, for Claudia. Like, when you're creating those clusters and then their representatives as briefs to the creative person, like, do you construct either for yourself or for them, like, the objective as being to target more finely, like, who would receive the advertisement, or as a means of exploring the space to find the global winner faster?
So it turns out for targeting, I don't need any of it. In targeting, you can get away with murder in the sense that the complexity of the model is so large that it can almost represent all these different personalities in just different subspaces of those million things. It gets more interesting if you want to target like the one person differently from the other, but then it really just means the way we did that in the planning was we just built 20 different models on the experimental data. And then for a given person, I asked my 20 models that each of them was trained on a different creative exposure, so conditional and creative. And then I picked the creative where the model had the highest prediction. So even there, you can get away. If you have good experimental data, you can learn it from that without having to explain the personality that is sitting underneath. But that still assumes, like in Giovanni, you have 20 decent creatives that have this heterogeneity effect that you're looking for, right? If you don't yet have that creative that you can then experiment to collect the data, that you can train the model to then target, then you have nothing to work with. So right now, this is purely for human consumption. It's about, here's something interesting you may want to know. For targeting, I wouldn't actually need it. At least I can see how I can get away without it because it's all baked in as long as I optimize for the right thing.
Any final questions? Yeah.
What are your plans after Kenya?
Sorry?
What are your plans after Kenya?
After. Oh, boy.
What about the U.S.?
Retirement.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think I'll stop working in Kenya for very many reasons. One is actually, like, there's huge fixed costs of working in any one country, like enormous fixed costs. And so that's really, a lot of people are like, why don't you come work here? And I'm like, no, can't do it. Another
It's not
plane
like
ride.
moving from Twitter to Facebook.
Exactly, no,
Going
it's-
from Kenya to South Africa.
Yeah. So, yeah, I don't think that's going to change, unfortunately. Or fortunately, I don't know which one. Better for the environment. I won't be traveling around so much.
Well, I think I will stop working in advertising.
If you want to come work in Kenya.
Yeah.
No, not right now.
You're not selling this well, I have to tell you.
It is beautiful. If I could kick out the politicians, it would be a beautiful country and the most awesome country in the world.
All right. So thank you very much to our panelists. Fantastic panel.